The frozen surface of Lake Ladoga shimmered under the pale winter sun. A single dark shape rested half buried in the snow, a shape that, for the men who found it, looked almost like a fallen beast. The red stars on their sleeves marked them as Soviet soldiers. The Iron Cross on the wreck before them marked their enemy. The aircraft was almost intact. Its fuselage gleamed dull gray under a layer of frost. Stenciled along the side was a name every Soviet pilot knew too well: Focke-Wulf FW-190. It was the winter of 1943, and for the first time, the Red Air Force had captured Germany's most feared fighter in perfect condition. For 2 long years, the FW-190 had dominated the skies over Europe. On the Western Front, British and American pilots had learned to fear its speed and firepower. But on the Eastern Front, its reputation was something darker, a whisper among Soviet pilots before every sortie. They called it the Butcher Bird. It was faster, climbed harder, rolled quicker, and tore Soviet aircraft apart with its 4 20-millimeter cannons. Pilots described seeing their comrades vanish in a single burst, their planes shredded before they could even fire back. The FW-190 seemed untouchable, and now one of those monsters was sitting motionless on Russian ice. The story of how it got there began weeks earlier. In January 1943, Oberfeldwebel Helmut Brandt of Jagdgeschwader 54 took off from an airfield near the front lines. He was young, skilled, and confident. His FW-190A4 carried the pride of the Luftwaffe, a radial BMW 801 engine capable of 1,700 horsepower, and the kind of handling that let German pilots dance circles around their enemies. But that morning, luck wasn't on his side. Over the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga, Brandt engaged a group of Soviet fighters. During the fight, a single round struck his propeller hub. Vibration tore through the cockpit. Smoke filled the canopy. With his engine dying, Brandt made a desperate decision. He glided down and landed on the frozen lake. He survived. But before he could set fire to his aircraft, Soviet troops reached him. Brandt was taken prisoner, and the unburned FW-190 became the most valuable prize the Red Air Force had ever captured. When the plane was pulled from the ice, Soviet engineers could hardly believe what they saw. It was intact. The engine, propellers, instruments, everything was recoverable. Within days, it was loaded onto sleds and transported to the Air Force's Scientific Research Institute near Moscow. The order from the top was clear: take it apart, test it, and find out how to kill it. At the time, the Soviet Air Force was still recovering from the disaster of 1941 and 1942. Entire regiments had been wiped out during the German advance. New aircraft like the Yak-9 and LA-5 were entering service, but no one truly knew how they compared to the FW-190. Soviet pilots fought bravely, but their tactics were based on guesswork and improvisation. Now they finally had the enemy's weapon in their hands. When the FW-190 arrived at the test facility, mechanics worked through the night under floodlights. The frost melted from its skin, revealing elegant German engineering: heavy rivets, reinforced panels, a cockpit designed for efficiency. The plane looked simple, even crude in places, but everything served a purpose. Chief Engineer Vladimir Tsibin led the inspection. His team stripped the fuselage, logged every cable and lever, then reassembled it for flight. They found the radial BMW 801 engine unlike anything in Soviet service. The double-row 14-cylinder design produced immense torque but was tightly packed, leaving almost no space for cooling airflow. To the Soviets, it was both impressive and flawed. The Germans built this machine for aggression, Tsibin noted. Power over endurance, speed over stability. That insight would later shape their entire strategy. Test pilot Captain Mikhail Ivanov was chosen to fly the captured FW-190. When he first climbed into the cockpit, he was shocked by the difference from Soviet aircraft. Everything inside was practical, no unnecessary instruments, just precision. The canopy gave perfect visibility. The stick was smooth and light. When the engine started, the vibration was minimal, the sound deep and confident. Ivanov taxied down the snowy runway and pushed the throttle. The aircraft surged forward like a predator, finally freed from its cage. He lifted off, climbing rapidly through the cold Moscow air. Within seconds, he understood why the FW-190 terrified Allied pilots. The controls were unbelievably responsive. The plane rolled almost instantly. Even slight stick pressure made it bank sharply. Its acceleration was fierce, but when Ivanov climbed higher, past 6,000 meters, something changed. The engine began to wheeze. The climb rate dropped. The once smooth power curve flattened out. He tried pushing the throttle, but the aircraft refused to respond. That's when he realized what German pilots never wanted anyone to know. The FW-190 was deadly, but only in its own domain. Back on the ground, the engineers swarmed the aircraft with notebooks and gauges. Over the next weeks, they conducted dozens of tests: climb rates, turn circles, dive angles, control response at speed. The data shocked them. At low altitudes, the FW-190 could easily outperform the Yak-1, LeGG-3, and even early Yak-9 models. It rolled nearly twice as fast. Its dive acceleration was astonishing, and its 20mm cannons tore holes through armor that Soviet aircraft couldn't match. But every advantage came with a cost. The radial engine's cooling system struggled above 6,000 meters. Its heavy weight reduced sustained turning ability. At high speeds, the control stick became so stiff that pilots needed both hands to pull out of dives. And its frame, so rugged at low altitude, produced violent buffeting when pushed too high. That's when Soviet engineers smiled. The FW-190, they realized, wasn't a monster. It was a specialist, unbeatable only under certain conditions. If Soviet pilots learned to avoid those conditions, they could survive. If they learned to reverse them, they could win. The findings were quickly sent to every frontline regiment. New tactical bulletins circulated under orders from the Air Force Command. Do not engage the FW-190 at low altitude. Climb first, force it high. At altitude, the BMW engine will falter. Use vertical maneuvers, not horizontal turns. Pilots were drilled to recognize the German silhouette: broad wings, round nose, distinctive roll. They practiced counter moves using captured data. The Yak-9s and LA-5FNs, especially the new LA-5FN with its improved Shvetsov engine, became the spearheads of this new doctrine. Their engines thrived in thinner air, where the German fighter gasped. Within months, Soviet kill ratios began to shift. In the spring of 1943, during air battles near the Oral-Kursk front, Soviet pilots began reporting something unprecedented: FW-190s disengaging and fleeing upward instead of pressing attacks. The reason was simple. Soviet squadrons had learned the secret. A Yak-9 squadron leader later recalled, "We stopped chasing them at tree level. We climbed, waited, and watched. When they came down, we met them at their weakest point, in thin air, where their engines coughed." The once invincible Butcher Bird was no longer a mystery, but the intelligence impact went deeper than tactics. The captured FW-190 influenced Soviet aircraft design. Engineers studying its wide-track landing gear realized its stability during takeoff and landing was far superior to narrow-gear Soviet planes. Future models like the LA-7 and Yak-3 adopted sturdier undercarriages. Its cockpit layout inspired instrument reorganization in new prototypes, prioritizing pilot visibility and ergonomics over cramped dashboards. And perhaps most importantly, it changed the way Soviet designers thought about combat altitude. Before the tests, Soviet doctrine favored low-altitude fights close to the front line. Afterward, they prioritized energy tactics, using climbs and dives instead of tight turns. The difference showed in combat. On July 5, 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, Soviet pilots met large formations of German fighters, including FW-190s of JG-51 and JG-54. The Luftwaffe expected another slaughter. Instead, Soviet aircraft fought with new discipline. They refused to follow Germans into low-altitude traps. They used altitude advantage, coordination, and concentrated attacks. By the end of the day, Soviet reports listed more than a dozen FW-190s downed for the loss of only a few of their own. It was the first time in the war that Red Air Force pilots claimed numerical air superiority over an equal German force. The captured fighter had rewritten the rules. As months passed, the Soviets continued dissecting every mechanical detail. The WWII engineers noticed the FW-190's complex electrical system with its automatic engine controls. It allowed the pilot to focus entirely on combat instead of manually adjusting propeller pitch and mixture. Soviet designers adapted similar automation for late-war Yak and La series fighters. They also analyzed the plane's armament configuration. 4 20mm MG 151 cannons synchronized with 2 machine guns. The close grouping allowed short, precise bursts. Soviet fighters, which often mounted weapons in the nose, learned to imitate that concentrated pattern, increasing hit probability. The more they studied it, the more the FW-190 became not an enemy, but a teacher. In August 1943, test pilot Ivanov summarized his findings for command. His words were blunt. The FW-190 is dangerous only if you play by its rules. It dives faster, rolls quicker, and shoots harder, but it cannot breathe above 6,000 meters. Force it there, and the advantage is ours. His report circulated across the Soviet Air Force. Training schools added entire lessons based on the captured aircraft. Posters showing its silhouette hung on walls beside photos of Spitfires and Messerschmitts. Knowledge became the weapon that finally leveled the sky. By 1944, Soviet fighters were no longer inferior. The LA-7, Yak-9U, and other improved variants could match or exceed the FW-190 in climb, speed, and agility. The tables had turned. German pilots who once mocked Soviet machines now faced enemies that seemed always to appear out of the sun, strike, and vanish. One captured German ace later admitted, "They had learned our rhythm. They no longer fought like before. They knew exactly when our engines gasped and our controls locked. It was as if they were flying our aircraft better than we were." The FW-190, recovered from Lake Ladoga, continued to serve the Soviets throughout the war as a test platform. It flew under Red Air Force markings, studied against every new German variant that appeared. Engineers compared it to the Bf-109G, the newer FW-190D Dora, and even captured versions of Allied aircraft supplied through Lend-Lease. Each test refined Soviet doctrine. Each flight turned the enemy's secrets into Soviet advantage. By the war's end, the Red Air Force had completely transformed from a desperate, undertrained force in 1941 to a technologically advanced, tactically disciplined air arm that dominated the skies from Berlin to Prague. And it all began with that single mistake. One German pilot lost in the fog of war, landing his fighter on a frozen lake. Helmut Brandt, the pilot who had accidentally delivered Germany's prized aircraft to the Soviets, spent the rest of the war in captivity. He survived, returned to Germany after 1945, and lived quietly until the 1980s. His name appears in few records, but among aviation historians, he's remembered as the man whose error helped tip the air balance of the Eastern Front. Today, replicas of that same FW-190, marked with Soviet red stars, are displayed in Russian aviation museums. Its story is told not as a trophy, but as a symbol of adaptation, proof that even in war, knowledge can be more powerful than firepower. Because once the Soviets understood how the FW-190 worked, they never feared it again. When we look back at World War II, we often talk about great battles and grand strategies. Kursk, Stalingrad, Berlin. But history often turns on smaller, quieter moments. A pilot's mistake, a frozen lake, a machine taken apart by engineers who refused to be afraid. The capture of the FW-190 wasn't just a lucky break. It was a turning point in the unseen war of intelligence, where every bolt, every line of data could mean the difference between defeat and survival. That aircraft, built by German hands and delivered by accident, became a teacher to its enemies. It exposed the limits of German engineering pride and gave the Soviets something more valuable than technology: understanding. By the time Berlin fell in 1945, Soviet pilots flew confidently through the same skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe. They had mastered their enemy's creation, learned its strengths, and used its flaws to end its reign. The FW-190 remains a legend, but so does the story of the day the Red Air Force tamed it. Because sometimes the most powerful victories don't come from bullets or bombs. They come from knowing your enemy better than he knows himself. And all it took was one lost pilot and one frozen lake.